June 9th, 1944, Normandy. A quiet morning shattered by the roar of engines and the scream of steel. In the hedgerows near Norry-en-Bessin, Sergeant G.K., Henry's Sherman Firefly, waited hidden, silent, and deadly. Before the next 12 minutes were over, he and his crew would destroy 5 of Germany's most feared tanks and rewrite the rules of tank warfare forever. The fields of Normandy were drenched in morning mist, heavy with the scent of mud and smoke. Sergeant Henry sat behind the gunner's sight of his Firefly, his heartbeat steady, his eyes locked through the narrow periscope slit. Out in the distance, a column of German Panther tanks rolled confidently across the countryside. Their armor, 80 millimeters thick and sloped to perfection, had shrugged off every Allied shell since D-Day. To the young men of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Shermans ahead were prey, not predators. Inside Henry's tank, the crew waited in tense silence. The loader's hands trembled slightly as he prepared the next round. "Load 17-pounder," Henry ordered calmly. The metallic thud of the shell sliding into the breech broke the stillness. At roughly 800 yards, Henry exhaled slowly, adjusted his aim, and pulled the trigger. The Firefly roared to life. The tungsten-cored round screamed from the barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second, slicing through the Norman air before slamming into the lead Panther's turret. A flash, then a burst of orange flame and smoke. The impossible had just happened. The supposedly invincible German tank was burning. Within moments, the Firefly traversed, left another target, another shot. The second Panther erupted. The battlefield, moments before echoing with German confidence, now filled with shouts of confusion and terror. In less than a minute, 2 Panthers were destroyed, then 3, then 5. For the first time, German tankers found themselves facing death from the front, their armor useless, their doctrine shattered. The radio chatter from the surviving Panthers was frantic. "They're hitting us frontally! It's impossible!" one voice cried. But it wasn't impossible, it was the arrival of a new kind of Allied weapon, a fusion of British ingenuity and American steel. As the smoke drifted across the fields of Norry-en-Bessin, Henry's crew sat stunned in their cramped metal shell. The smell of cordite filled the air, their ears rang from the concussion of their own gunfire, and outside, the proud German advance lay in flames. That morning was more than just a battle, it was a moment of revelation. For the first time, Allied crews could look across a field and know they had a weapon capable of standing toe-to-toe with Germany's best. And behind that victory lay a story of desperate innovation, sleepless engineers, and a nation that refused to accept defeat. When British tankers first encountered the German Panther and Tiger tanks in 1943, it was like watching the future of warfare roll toward them, unstoppable, methodical, and terrifying. The standard British and American Shermans were reliable, even fast, but their 75mm guns might as well have been pea-shooters against the thick, sloped armor of the new German designs. The Allies could outnumber the enemy, but they could not outgun him. Every encounter ended the same way. Allied tanks burned while Panthers and Tigers advanced untouched. It was a crisis of survival, and it demanded something extraordinary. Back in Britain, military engineers were desperate for a solution. They already possessed a weapon that could kill a Panther. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun, one of the most powerful in the world. In its towed form, it could punch through 140 millimeters of armor from over a kilometer away. The problem was, it was far too big to fit inside any existing British tank. They tried everything. The new A-30 Challenger was supposed to carry it, but that project was plagued with design problems and delays. The Cromwell's turret ring was too small, the Churchill was too slow, and new designs were years away. Time, in 1943, was something the Allies didn't have. And then came the idea that would change everything. Major George Brighty of the Royal Tank Regiment and WGK. Kilbourne, a brilliant engineer at Vickers, proposed a radical plan: take the American-made M4 Sherman and fit the massive British 17-pounder inside its turret. On paper, it was madness. The 17-pounder was huge. Its recoil alone would smash through the back of a standard Sherman turret. But Brighty and Kilbourne weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for survival. Their first attempts were crude steel plates, cut, welded, and reshaped in makeshift workshops. The recoil problem seemed unsolvable, The gun needed nearly 40 inches of space to recoil, but the Sherman turret simply didn't have it. Then Kilbourne had an idea that would become legendary in British engineering circles. He turned the entire recoil system sideways. Instead of long cylinders running behind the gun, he mounted two shorter cylinders horizontally, one on each side. It was a simple yet brilliant reconfiguration, sacrificing depth for width, and just enough to make it work. But that change created another problem. The 17-pounder's breech block opened downward, making it impossible to load quickly in the cramped turret. So Kilbourne rotated the entire breech 90 degrees, allowing it to open to the left instead. Now, the loader could work comfortably, sliding the heavy 17-pound shells straight into the chamber. Still, every solution seemed to create a new problem. The radio normally sat behind the gunner in the turret bustle space, now completely consumed by the new recoil system. Kilbourne's fix? Cut a hole in the back of the turret and weld on an armoured box. This radio bustle became one of the Firefly's most distinctive features and also served as a perfect counterweight for the enormous barrel. But even after solving the engineering puzzle, the human element remained. Inside that cramped turret, the new gun took up so much space that the loader could barely move. If the tank was hit, escape would be nearly impossible. So Kilbourne ordered a new hatch to be cut into the turret roof, an emergency exit directly above the gunner's position. It was a small detail, but one that would save countless lives. The changes didn't stop there. The long 17-pounder shells were too big for the Sherman's existing ammunition racks. To make room, the assistant driver's position and the hull machine gun were removed entirely. The crew went from 5 men to 4. It wasn't ideal, but it was necessary. By late 1943, the first prototype rolled out of a British workshop. It was ugly, unbalanced, and loud, but it worked. The massive gun fit, the recoil was manageable, and the firepower was astonishing. For the first time, the British had a tank that could kill a Panther frontally. They called it the Sherman Firefly, a name that came from the brilliant flash of its muzzle blast, visible even in daylight. The troops loved it immediately. It was a symbol of defiance, a machine that embodied British determination to stand toe-to-toe with the enemy, no matter the odds. By early 1944, production began in earnest. Old Shermans, mostly the M4A4 variant, were sent to workshops in London, Manchester, and Nottingham for conversion. In just a few months, hundreds were ready. Each troop of 4 tanks would now include one Firefly, a silent guardian among its brothers. Yet, even as the tanks rolled out, there were doubts. Many officers thought the recoil would shake the turret apart. Others worried the barrel was too long and too easy a target. But those concerns would vanish soon enough, on the battlefields of Normandy. Because the Firefly wasn't just another tank, it was proof that innovation could bloom under fire, that courage wasn't limited to the battlefield. It lived in the minds of engineers who refused to accept defeat, in the welders and mechanics who worked through the night under blackout skies, and in the crews who would soon take these strange hybrids into combat. And when they did, the world would see what British resolve and one very big gun could do. The Sherman Firefly rolled into battle not as a product of grand design, but of desperate ingenuity. Its creators had only months to prepare it, and the men who would fight in it had even less time to learn its ways. By May 1944, just weeks before the D-Day invasion, most British and Canadian tank crews were seeing their Fireflies for the first time. There was no luxury of long training programs or firing ranges. Many gunners, like Joe Ekins of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, fired fewer than 5 practice rounds before being sent into combat. The new 17-pounder's recoil was thunderous, the flash blinding, and the dust kicked up by its muzzle blast so thick it often obscured the target after every shot. Yet, despite these challenges, the Firefly crews understood one thing. They finally had a gun that could kill the enemy's best tanks. On June 6, 1944 D-Day, the first Fireflies went ashore on the beaches of Normandy. Some were still on landing craft, firing inland like floating artillery to suppress German coastal defences. Others came ashore later that day, their tracks biting into the wet French sand, their crews looking toward the countryside ahead, a maze of hedgerows, narrow lanes, and hidden ambushes. In those first chaotic days, British and Canadian forces pushed inland toward the key city of Caen. The Germans countered fiercely. Among them were the veterans of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, boys barely out of their teens but armed with Panthers and Panzer IVs. For the Allied tankers, this was the crucible where faith in the Firefly would be tested by fire and steel. The first major engagement came on June 9th, just 3 days after D-Day, at Norry-en-Bessin. A formation of 12 Panthers rolled forward to attack Canadian positions held by the Regina Rifles, supported by British armour from the Elgin Regiment. Among them was Sergeant G.K. Henry and his Firefly. Hidden behind a hedgerow, his tank lay in ambush, only the top of its turret visible. Henry waited until the Panthers were within 800 yards, close enough to ensure a hit but far enough to stay unseen. His loader, hands trembling with anticipation, shoved a 17-pound shell into the breach. "On the way," Henry said quietly. The shot rang out, echoing across the fields. The lead Panther's turret erupted in flame. The Germans were stunned. Nothing should have been able to pierce their armour at that range. Before they could react, Henry fired again. A second Panther burst into fire. Within minutes, 5 Panthers lay burning in the fields, and the rest were in full retreat. Out of 12 tanks that attacked, 7 were destroyed, 5 by Henry's Firefly alone. It was a revelation. The impossible had happened. The myth of German invincibility was dead. From that day on, the Firefly became both a symbol of hope and a weapon of fear. German tankers began referring to it as the Fire Devil, for its devastating power and blinding muzzle flash. Allied troops saw it as their great equalizer, the answer to months of humiliation and loss. But victory came with a price. The Firefly's long barrel made it easy to identify, even at a distance. German gunners were taught to target any Sherman with a long gun first. Within weeks, standing orders in panzer units read, "Destroy the long-barreled Shermans. First, they are the deadly ones." To survive, Firefly crews turned to deception. They painted the front half of the barrel white to blend against the sky, or mounted fake muzzle brakes halfway along to make it look shorter. These small tricks often bought them the few precious seconds needed to fire first, and in tank warfare, seconds were everything. The Firefly was not a perfect tank. It was slower than the Cromwell, harder to load, and its ammunition was bulky. Inside, the noise and shock of firing the 17-pounder could leave crews dazed and half-deafened. But it could do one thing no Allied tank had done before, kill a Panther or Tiger head-on. By July, Fireflies were spread across British, Canadian, and Polish units in Normandy. Their doctrine was simple but deadly effective. Let the regular Shermans engage and draw fire, while the Firefly hung back in overwatch, waiting for the enemy to expose themselves. When they did, the 17-pounder spoke. One of the most famous examples came 2 months later, on August 8, 1944, during Operation Totalize. In a wooded area south of Caen, a young gunner named Joe Eakins, barely 21 years old, spotted 3 Tiger tanks advancing in the open. They were commanded by none other than SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, the most celebrated tank ace in Germany, credited with over 130 kills. Eakins had fired fewer than a dozen live rounds in training, yet when the order came, he aimed calmly and fired. One Tiger exploded. He reloaded, fired again. A second Tiger stopped, smoke pouring from its hatches. A third burst into flames. In the space of 12 minutes, Eakins had destroyed 3 Tigers, one of them likely Wittmann's. The news spread like wildfire. The Firefly, the so-called impossible conversion, was now the bane of German armour. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Firefly had earned a reputation far beyond what its modest beginnings suggested. It wasn't the fastest or the toughest, but in the hands of determined men, it became a legend. For the crews who fought in them, each shot fired was more than a victory, it was redemption for years of loss. From the beaches of Normandy to the fields of France, the Firefly gave Allied tankers something they hadn't felt in a long time: confidence. And as German commanders soon discovered, a confident soldier with a powerful weapon is the most dangerous force in war. By the summer of 1944, a quiet but undeniable shift had begun to ripple across the battlefields of Western Europe. For the first time since the fall of France in 1940, British and Commonwealth tankers no longer felt like the hunted. The arrival of the Sherman Firefly and the thunderous voice of its 17-pounder gun had changed everything. For German tank crews, it was a nightmare. The first encounters in Normandy had left them stunned. Radio intercepts and after-action reports from panzer divisions described long-barreled Shermans capable of frontal penetration. To men who had spent years believing their Panthers and Tigers were invincible, that revelation was terrifying. A Tiger crewman from the 2nd SS Panzer Division would later recall, "We were told nothing could pierce our armor from the front. And then one day, a British shell came through like it was paper. We didn't believe it until we saw the fire." The psychological balance of tank warfare had flipped. Before the Firefly, Allied crews entered battle knowing that one mistake, one exposure meant death. They relied on speed, flanking, and courage to close distance for a side shot. Against the 88mm guns of the Tiger or the long 75mm of the Panther, that was a deadly gamble. Firefly crews, however, could now fight from range. They could see a German tank and know their gun could reach it, strike it, and destroy it. That single truth gave birth to something more powerful than any armor plate confidence. And confidence, in war, changes everything. Tactically, the British adapted fast. In each 4-tank troop, one Firefly became the spear's edge, positioned slightly to the rear and to the flank of its 3 standard Shermans. The smaller guns of the regular Shermans fired high explosive rounds, suppressing infantry and drawing enemy attention. Meanwhile, the Firefly waited silently for the enemy armor to reveal itself. Once a Panther exposed its front or silhouette, the 17-pounder roared. It was a simple, deadly dance, the bait and the strike. The 17-pounder's armor-piercing capped ballistic-capped APCBC ammunition could slice through 140mm of armor at 1,000 meters. German tankers, who used to engage at 1,500 yards with impunity, suddenly found themselves being picked off at that same range. Many didn't even realize they were under fire until their tanks were burning. The fear of the Firefly spread quickly. German doctrine was forced to adapt. New orders were issued across the panzer divisions. Prioritize the long-barreled Shermans. Eliminate them first. From that moment, every Firefly became a marked target. Firefly crews knew it. They could feel it. Every time they rolled into battle, they understood the enemy's eyes were searching for them first. It made survival a matter of cunning as much as courage. To disguise their identity, some crews painted the forward half of their barrels white or sky blue to blend against the horizon. Others added false muzzle brakes halfway down the barrel to make the gun appear shorter like a regular 75mm Sherman. From a distance, that deception might buy them 3 or 4 seconds of hesitation from a German gunner. 3 seconds could mean life or death. Despite being priority targets, Fireflies often suffered lower losses than standard Shermans. A post-war analysis of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry Regiment revealed that 19% of Fireflies were destroyed in combat, compared to 29% of standard Shermans. The reason was tactical. Fireflies were used as overwatch snipers, fighting from hull, down positions, concealed behind hedgerows or rubble. They were designed to strike from the shadows, not lead charges. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, dense, close, and claustrophobic, this tactic was perfect. A Firefly could hide behind a wall of foliage, its long barrel poking through a gap. From there, it could ambush a Panther the moment it rolled into view. The gun's immense velocity meant the round reached the target in a fraction of a second, often striking before the German even saw the flash. The effect on morale was profound on both sides. British and Canadian crews began to believe again. They could fight, they could win, and they could come home. Their stories spread through the ranks. The Firefly at Norry-en-Bessin that killed 5 Panthers in minutes. The young gunner Joe Ekins who destroyed 3 Tigers, including possibly Michael Whitman's before noon. Tales like these gave soldiers something the months of war had nearly erased: pride. Meanwhile, German tankers began suffering from what Allied intelligence called Panther paralysis. Crews grew hesitant to push forward, reluctant to expose their armor, even when ordered to counterattack. Their once dominant confidence, the sense of invulnerability, was gone. It wasn't just fear, it was disbelief. The very idea that the inferior Shermans could now destroy their prized tanks was psychologically devastating. Many crews hesitated before engaging, scanning every field and tree line for that one deadly long barrel. That hesitation cost them time, and in tank combat, time was fatal. And yet, The Firefly's power wasn't only measured in destroyed Panthers or burned Tigers. It was a symbol of adaptation under pressure, of engineering brilliance, of men who refused to yield. Its mere presence on the battlefield forced the German army to change its tactics, to question its supremacy. Inside every Firefly, courage and ingenuity lived side by side. The men who fought in them weren't invincible. They were often terrified, sweating in the stifling heat of their steel coffin, praying the next shell wouldn't find them. But they trusted their gun. They trusted each other. And in war, that trust was everything. As one veteran later recalled, "You didn't feel like prey anymore. When you saw a panther, you didn't hide, you aimed." That shift from fear to determination was the Firefly's greatest victory. By the end of 1944, wherever British armour advanced from Normandy's hedgerows to Holland's dikes and Belgium's frozen fields, the long, slender barrel of the Firefly led the way. Its thunder announced not just destruction but transformation. The men inside those tanks weren't just fighting for ground, they were fighting to prove that courage, creativity, and human will could overcome even the fiercest machines of war. By the time the dust of Normandy settled, the Sherman Firefly had already earned a reputation that stretched far beyond its steel frame. To German tank crews, it was the phantom that stalked the fields, the gun that pierced the invincible. To Allied soldiers, it was the equalizer, proof that determination and ingenuity could stand against the best the enemy could build. Between June and August of 1944, nearly 400 Fireflies were in action across Normandy. They fought in every major British and Commonwealth operation: Epsom, Goodwood, Totalize, Tractable. Wherever German armour appeared, the Fireflies were there too silent until the moment they spoke, unleashing the thunder of the 17-pounder. It wasn't just about destruction, it was about transformation. Before the Firefly, Allied strategy had been shaped by compromise, overwhelm through numbers, flank from the sides, and hope that courage could compensate for inferior firepower. After the Firefly, that changed. For the first time since the early days of the war, Allied tankers could face German armour on equal footing. They no longer had to fight like underdogs. They could fight like equals and often like predators. German tank commanders noticed. Reports from the summer of 1944 warned that enemy Shermans with long guns were killing Panthers and Tigers at ranges once thought impossible. Confidence, once the lifeblood of the Panzer divisions, began to crumble. Crews became cautious, hesitant, and slow. And in war, hesitation kills. But the Firefly's story didn't end with victory in Normandy. Through the fall and winter of 1944, more Fireflies poured into service. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, most British and Canadian armoured regiments fielded 2 Fireflies per troop instead of 1. Each was a sliver of steel assurance in a battlefield thick with uncertainty. They fought through Belgium, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany itself. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, around 2,200 Sherman Fireflies had been built. Each one was a triumph of necessity over limitation, of resourcefulness over despair. They had begun as a desperate improvisation, a stopgap solution, but ended as one of the most effective Allied tanks of the war. And their influence didn't fade when the guns fell silent. After the war, the Firefly continued to serve wherever freedom needed defending. When North Korea invaded the South in 1950, British-supplied Fireflies were pulled from reserve and sent to the peninsula. Against Soviet-made T-34 divided by 85 seconds, they proved that the 17-pounder still had teeth. The gun that once killed Panthers now tore through T-34 seconds at over 1,000 yards. 6 years after Hitler's fall, the Firefly was still fighting tyranny. In Israel, too, the Firefly found new life. During the War of Independence in 1948, and later conflicts in the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, Israeli crews used converted Fireflies as the backbone of their fledgling armoured corps. They upgraded the guns, added new engines, and repainted them with the Star of David, but the spirit of the Firefly remained unchanged. It was still a weapon born from defiance, serving a people who refused to surrender. The 17-pounder itself also left a lasting mark. Its descendant, the 20-pounder, became the main armament of the British Centurion tank the most successful post-war design in the world. From there, the lineage continued to the famous L7 105mm gun, and then to the Challenger II's L30 rifled cannon. Modern tank ammunition, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds can trace its ancestry directly to the 17-pounders APDS shells. The technology that began in 1943 lives on in every modern battlefield today. But perhaps the Firefly's greatest legacy wasn't mechanical at all. It was human. It proved that even in the darkest moments, innovation could flourish. It showed that a handful of engineers, mechanics, and tank crews could change the course of a war not through resources, but through resilience. The Firefly was not elegant. It was not beautiful. But it was honest, built with grit, born of necessity, and carried by courage. Veterans who fought in them often spoke of the bond they shared with their machines. They remembered the deafening roar of the gun, the sting of cordite in their nostrils, the bruises from recoil. But above all, they remembered the feeling of firing back, of standing their ground when it mattered most. One veteran, years later, put it simply, "Before the Firefly, we survived. After it, we fought." Oh, in the end, that was what the Firefly truly represented: the return of balance and the triumph of human spirit over mechanical terror. The Germans built tanks that inspired fear. The British built one that inspired hope. When the last Fireflies were retired in the late 1952, many were scrapped, their steel melted down and reused. But a few still survive in museums, in collections, and on parade grounds. When you stand beside one today, you can still feel its presence, the long barrel pointing toward the horizon, the scars of battle still etched into its armor. It doesn't look like much beside a modern tank, but its story whispers louder than any engine. It speaks of nights in makeshift workshops where engineers defied the impossible, of young men who faced death with steady hands, of a weapon that gave courage back to those who had almost lost it. The Sherman Firefly wasn't just a tank, it was a statement. A promise that even when outgunned, outmatched, and outnumbered, the human will to fight back will always find a way. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, on that morning of June 9th, 1944, when Sergeant Henry's 17-pounder roared and 5 Panthers burst into flame, that promise was fulfilled. If you enjoyed this story of bravery and innovation, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with friends and family who love history and courage as much as you do. Every share helps keep these incredible stories of World War II heroes alive. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and join the WWII Courage community to discover more untold moments of valor, sacrifice, and triumph from the war that shaped our world.